Right, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Welcome to session 2 of internal family systems. A very interesting area of study that's emerged in the recent years, although the tenets or the basic principles have been around for years, but very beautifully integrated and put forward by Richard Schwartz, who is the founder of the theory. So in the last part, which was the introductory session, we spoke about the primary assumptions of IFS, internal family systems. Primary assumptions are basically that all of us, while there is a general tendency to believe that we are one personality, we have various parts within us, which is integrated by a central core, which we could call the self. And the self ideally should direct and manage all these other parts that we host. So those parts put together are our internal family. So like we have, yes, part of our ego consciousness, yes. So like we would have an external father or a mother or a child, we have all of those parts, those and more. And so the self is primarily the integrator of these parts. And ideally, the self should also be the director of all of these parts. But yes, sometimes the self does get back into the shadows, and then it becomes a process of reclaiming the self and making sure that the other parts are held properly. So we spoke about the self being the primary holder of consciousness in our internal system, and there are various parts. There are primarily three categories of parts. There's the manager, there's the firefighter, and there's the exile. The three broad categories. There are all the various other things within these parts. And we also spoke about the fact that some parts may carry burdens. So burdens are in the form of either traumas or bad memories, unpleasant feelings, which is held by one of the many parts that's there in us, and usually the tendency is to then exile this part, the part that carries a burden. Now, the part in itself is not bad. All parts are good and all parts are ultimately trying to serve the self, but yes, sometimes the burdens are so heavy and so bad that it is a little difficult to deal with. So the purpose of this journey, of this series of talks, is to look at firstly conceptually understanding parts and figuring out how do we identify our own parts, and then in the later part of the series we can go into what might be termed as processes or rituals to actually get in touch with these parts. And there is also a possibility of extending those rituals into internal family and internal ancestral families that we also hold in us, because there is a lot of genetic memory of the ancestry that we carry, and those parts may still very well be alive. So a lot of us tend to carry parts that belonged to our fathers and grandfathers and great grandfathers, and whatever they have not processed in them lives through us, and
So those patterns are with us and we
yes,
carry them.
yes. So sometimes they may be great.
Yeah.
So that then comes up as natural strengths or talents, as you will, but sometimes they are traumas, which then comes up in the form of beliefs that are limiting in nature or thoughts that are unresourceful in nature. So there's a lot of work that can be done through the IFS model. As I said, this was developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz, primarily as a psychotherapeutic model. But the beauty of it is it's a very simple system. All it says is there's self at the center and there are these parts around, and the primary work around the model is to integrate parts. Try and integrate it as much into the self, which primarily means accept it into the self without judging, labeling. So the beauty of IFS is it combines sub-personalities and all the work around personality and bipolar and subpersonalities and split personalities that has happened around in psychology over the years. It combines that with what's called a systems thinking, which is a social constructionist approach, an aspect of sociology. So it combines both those aspects very beautifully to say that the way our world is constructed outside, which means there's a system around us, so we have a political system or an organization system, or even a family as an institution is a system. So while we live, the reason we live and create systems all around us all the time is because there are systems within us. So we tend to duplicate what's in us outside of us. So therefore, in a very extrapolated sense, what IFS proposes is that if you're looking at shifting systems outside the world, including aspects like peace building, it has to start with internal systems, because till the time the internal systems are present, we will seek to duplicate it outside. So the organizations we build, the families we build will be reflective of the internal system. So today's focus is on one particular kind of a part that we have in us. So primarily there are two categories. There's the protector and there's the protected. Okay? So the protected part is usually the exiled part of us, the parts that we don't like to deal with. So parts that may have been in the past, let's say, robbed or met with an accident or abused or anything that's not pleasant for us. And when I say not pleasant, the part in itself may not be bad. So for example, it's possible that we may have exiled a part which in the past was extremely rich and successful. And because we do not identify with that space anymore, we may very well have exiled that part.
You mean it is a memory or it is a personality, part of personality?
It could be a part of our experience. We may have lived through it. Yeah. So it's just that because that's no longer our reality, for whatever reason we choose to exile it, because visiting that space, even in terms of memory, brings up feelings that it may or may not be harmful, but it's certainly unpleasant. Yeah. Sometimes it may be harmful in the sense if it leads to suicidal tendencies or depression, yes.
Because in present days also, in logically also, we try to push back our unpleasant memories.
Yes.
Not in subconscious, conscious mind.
Consciously also.
We'll see later, later. But actually the part is there.
Yeah. It's very alive.
Alive, yeah.
Right? So, in other words, if you look at Jungian and Freudian psychology, we would call it shadows.
Shadows, yeah.
Right? So that's another perspective of dealing with exiles. Here we just call them exiles in the sense we know they are very much alive, but they're sent out there into the forest to not come back for another few years. Right? So that's exile. So exiles are the protected parts. Protected because we are trying to protect ourselves from those parts. And who does the protection is the parts that are the protector. So there are primarily two kinds of protector. There's the manager and there's the firefighter. Now usually most of us would be in touch with our managers on a day-to-day basis. And not necessary that when we say protector, these parts are bad. These parts are also extremely functional, extremely useful. And they may not always be trying to subside bad feelings. They may be doing regular things in the course of life also. So they are very functional parts. So managers especially are parts of us that are very proactive. They're constantly anticipating what next. They're planning for the future. So it's that part of us that says, okay, next year if I have to take a vacation, I need to save this much money. I need to probably make a travel booking. I want to plan for my taxes this way. Or this week I have so many things to do, let me make a to-do list. So those are the parts of us that are managers. Right? They deal with day-to-day activities, they make sure we are kept productive and busy and functional. So extremely useful parts usually tend to be future oriented. Unlike the exile, which is past oriented, the managers are usually looking at what's coming up next and therefore how do we work backward to get there. So long as they are functional, the managers are fine. They're extremely useful, and it's good to have that conversation of gratitude with those managers within us. However, managers sometimes, depending on how much the exile is buried within, the managers sometimes have that subversive agenda of wanting to keep your life functional and busy so that we don't touch the exile. Right? So sometimes the managers would go into that mode where we say, okay, let me fill up my day with activities so that I don't have to think of what happened 20 years earlier. Right? So therefore, managers might sometimes end up making decisions like saying, okay, let me enroll for all these courses, let me go read that book, let me go for that networking meeting, let me do this, let me do that. And there's a whole lot of filling up of activities so that you're kept busy and therefore far away from the exile. So these are quick decision making paths that will tell you, okay, I want this, I don't want this, I should go there, I shouldn't go there, I like this person, I don't like this person. Those are our managers. So while they are useful, it's important to be aware of what the managers are doing, especially in times where we think that our days are being filled up to an extent where we don't enjoy it, where there's absolutely no time for leisure, where there's absolutely no time to just sit and stare, because there's something that the manager is trying to avoid in a very subconscious way. Right? So there are several manager paths in us. So we may have a work manager that looks at anticipating work related things. There's a home manager, there's a personal manager. There are all kinds of managers we have within us. And if you notice, different managers act differently. So your work manager may have a different agenda as compared to the home manager. The home manager might say, okay, let me not fill up my time at home. But the work manager might say, let me do as much as possible so I don't have to deal with certain other things. So each context has a different kind of an approach. So that's one kind of a protector, the manager who tries to manage and keep us future oriented so that we don't revisit the past.
Don't dwell upon the
the unpleasant feelings. And then there is the firefighter. Now the firefighter is literally, like the term says, the moment it sees a fire, it starts fighting and dousing the fire. Right? So the firefighter part typically comes up the moment there is a feeling that somewhere the manager is not doing his job, the manager part is not doing that job internally, and therefore we are very close to touching the exile. Right? Now we may or may not be consciously aware of it, but the firefighter starts jumping when either one possibility is the self loses confidence in the manager. It's sometimes the manager may have made wrong decisions, like let's say the manager may have made you go to a certain party where you didn't enjoy it or something unpleasant happened, and somewhere the self loses confidence in how did you make that decision. Right? So sometimes that's the case, sometimes the manager just fails, makes a wrong decision, and the firefighter has to emerge and fight the fire. So because it's fighting a fire, it's naturally reactive in approach, and therefore it will do absolutely anything to quell the fire in that moment, which means it will do anything that you can to make sure you don't touch the exile. Right? So typically the firefighter would make us do things like have excessive drinks, get into substance abuse, procrastinate, be lazy, get into depression, anything that will make us not touch that exile. So the moment
like then in if a person is under hypnosis, there also suppose bad memory is there. Sometimes that
the firefighter is active.
Because at that time they resist.
Yes.
Because that they don't want to dig up that memory.
Yeah, the firefighter can be very alive even under hypnosis. Yeah. They may not be able to stop the process, but they will try and resist the process. Yes. So firefighters are typically that part of us which, let's say, end of the day you've had a good day and then you have free time to yourself, and somewhere the consciousness realizes that, okay, there is now time to sit back and think about certain things. Here's where the firefighter will jump into action and say, oh, let me have an extra drink today, because it doesn't want to touch that thought or that emotion that otherwise the self would have touched and dealt with. Okay? So the role of the firefighter is to do anything and everything that will keep us from touching the exiled part. Now, the interesting thing with these two is that while both of them are playing the role of the protector, which means both of them have a common agenda. They want to protect us from the exiled part, the unpleasant parts, which are memories of trauma or abuse or any of those kind of parts. Although they have the same agenda, the way they function is extremely opposite. So the manager is doing all he or she can to make life functional, and the firefighter, because he appears only when there is that emergency, when it realizes we are very close to the exile, the firefighter tends to make very dysfunctional decisions. So typically if you look at the manager, yes, sometimes it's not functional in the sense, yeah, it'll play the role of an inner critic, or that critical parent within us which will say, no, you don't do this, it's not going to work for you. The part of us that brings in self-doubt and suspicion and all of that's the manager, but it tries to handle it in a controlled way, whereas the firefighter is disruptive, right? So it will make us do things which have consequences, but there's no control over those consequences.
Part of procrastination is also a firefighter sometimes,
yeah.
Because some unpleasant activity we don't want to deal with it.
Yes.
Then you procrastinate.
Yes.
Because
procrastination is a very common firefighter. Extremely common firefighter. So the managers, as we said, good at anticipating, controlling, planning, organizing. Very often the manager emerges as a critic. So if you are aware of that voice within us which is trying to say, no, not worth it, no, you can't do it, or that's not your cup of tea, that's typically that part speaking to us, which is the manager, which is trying to protect us from some kind of an unpleasant experience. Right? So, and sometimes the manager can also act as a defender. So even before we are attacked, we try lashing out so that the other person doesn't have a chance to attack. Right? So sometimes the role is that of being a submissive critic, so the defense is, or the lashing out is inward. Sometimes the lashing out is outward. But yeah, in general, the tendency of the manager is to be preemptive. It will think through the situation, it will start planning. So all those parts of us which have that tendency to say, okay, what does my day look like today? Let me plan for today. That's the manager within us acting. Right? And the firefighter, on the other hand, is, as I said, they come in when the managers fail, or the manager lets you too close to the exile, and therefore there is that discomfort. Now, of course, the firefighter, because of whatever action he or she chooses, can obviously cause damage, which could sometimes be physical damage if the firefighter is using techniques which involve substance abuse of any kind. Sometimes it could just be damage in the form of even procrastination, for example, that there's damage in the form of lost opportunities. Now, what IFS proposes is that, okay, it's possible that protectors of both kinds may have dysfunctional actions sometimes, right? When they stop us from using an opportunity or stop us from doing something, it does become dysfunctional. Now, the only reason they become dysfunctional is because somewhere the self, the core, is not in dialogue with the manager or the firefighter. And that's the reason the actions become dysfunctional, because they are acting on their own. In reality, neither the firefighter nor the manager likes to make decisions. Those are not the core decision making parts of us. The core is the self. It's just that for some reason the self is disconnected from reality or not engaging with the parts and therefore not making decisions, then these parts have to surface and pick up that role because somebody has to do it, right? So therefore the decision making aspect is forced upon either of these protectors, and in the process they might become dysfunctional. And sometimes, yeah, they may, you might find and we find in a lot of cases there is actually conflict between the inner protectors. The protectors themselves fight against each other, the manager and the firefighter. So there could be that inner critic manager that says, stupid, why did you have to have that extra drink? And the firefighter coming back and saying, I didn't want to face those emotions, so I did what I thought was right. It's so that there is that inner conflict between the two protectors, although they have the same agenda eventually. So when it comes to handling the protectors, I'm just touching upon this today. There are lots of exercises and rituals that we can touch upon later in the series, but primarily the call here is to say start dialoguing, and that's the essence of parts work. In IFS model works on integrating the parts, right? So most of parts work is about saying hang out with the parts, start talking to them, which one mode that a lot of people use is meditation. So the primary assumption being when you're in meditation, you're in touch with the self, the core, right? And self by definition here is that part of us which has clarity, which is the seat of consciousness.
In the meditation you have to find that emerging voice,
yes, you can there are different ways.
Go into that actual event or situation and then meditate on that?
No, the first piece that is always recommended with IFS is first get in touch with the self.
Okay.
Which means...
But thinking for that particular situation or...
yes, so eventually you can, yes, talk to the exiled part. But first point is get in touch with the self, because it is through that you will talk to that exiled part. Because if you directly go in touch with the exiled part, you might feel all those unpleasant things that are associated with it, but then there's nobody dialoguing.
Very difficult to identify.
It can be, depending on how buried it is. Yeah, sometimes it's really difficult to touch the exile. Right? So usually the initial exercise, and therefore we always talk of the protector first and then the exile later, because sometimes there are layers of protectors. So there's one defense after the other which is layered, and the exile is buried somewhere deep within. And a lot of times people are not even conscious of what the exile is. If you generally ask them, they may not even have a conscious memory of the exile.
Because they feel your heart. So some guidance comes during the meditation.
So here when we say feel your heart, the mode that we are talking about here is get in touch with the self through the heart. Mechanism primarily being, where am I here and now?
No, but some guidance.
Yes, it's possible that if you're really in touch and you're allowing that voice to flow in, yes, there could be guidance that flows in as well. Provided the protectors are at ease and they know they're safe. So therefore, with any IFS process, the first thing that's recommended is always center yourself and get in touch with the self.
Because many times counselors, they ask questions, so what, so what, so what, so what.
Yes.
So that a hidden things come out.
Yeah, because then you're going deep into the layers.
In meditation, we have to do that way?
If you very clearly know what your exile is, you can, because
then that particular event, and we should be clear of that.
Yeah. So somewhere if you're very consciously aware of it and you're able to even talk about the exile, then it's all right. You can actually initiate a dialogue, right, with all these parts. So you can invite the exile part along with all these other parts, and then actually have a conversation, round table kind of a thing that happens. So one modality, either of these exercises that we use, one modality that we usually use is have multiple chairs or multiple seatings in a room, at least 4 or 5. The self is positioned in one particular place, and the place is used as an anchor. The space, you create visual anchors around. So let's say if I'm here as the self and I'm in a position of being able to get in touch with myself, and I say that, okay, I'm here now and I am aware of this part of me that tends to procrastinate when it comes to a certain kind of a decision. Okay, so maybe it tends to procrastinate when it comes to making investments or start exercising, whatever is that part, right? So what I'm saying in terms of a dialogue is, here I am self, and I'm curious about why does this part of me constantly make these decisions of procrastinating, right? And let me invite that part of me, let me call it the procrastinator, let me call that part of me to have a conversation. And then you physically shift space and assume the role and also the energy of the procrastinator, right? So sometimes when we work using this, often we would find body language shifts, voice shifts for people, tone shifts when they are assuming that role. And the firefighter can come into a very, sometimes an aggressive, sometimes a very submissive form, and it can have that dialogue with that seat, which is the self, to say, yes, I am procrastinating, and I'm procrastinating because. And sometimes it has really valid reasons. And as we continue this dialogue, sometimes other parts start emerging. So the parts could be protectors and exiles in various forms. So paths could be as varied as saying an inner parent or an inner grandmother or some child or some student, some teacher, different paths that we have internalized over the years. All of those start emerging, and sometimes you would find that in these sessions you'll have a big round table of 5-6 people talking to each other and saying, I don't like you because you do this, and I don't like this one because it doesn't let me do this. So there's a lot of conversation that happens, and it's important that the self is very present in that conversation to say, I'm here to simply listen because I'm genuinely curious about what you as my internal family members are up to, right? And there is no judgment around it. I as self will assure that I'm not going to exile any of you after this process. Right? I'm genuinely here to listen and to understand from your perspective, why do you do what you do? Good or bad, either way, it doesn't really matter. I just want to understand why you do what you do. And sometimes one dialogue shifts the whole family. Sometimes you need several dialogues to say, okay, some parts may take up a contract at the end of it saying, okay, next time I will not do this, and we'll come back and have this dialogue later and see what happens. So you can have those kind of contracts that happen in the process. Now this process is an intuitive thing, so you can do it very safely by yourself also. The only caution I would advise is first make sure the self is present.
Otherwise it will be confusing.
See, you can still have that dialogue. Your protectors, your firefighter and some manager might emerge and still have that dialogue. It's just that sometimes in the process, because the self is not present and committed to that process of integration, the exile might be pushed even deeper. Yeah, because somewhere both of them have a common agenda of pushing the exile down, right? So you're in a way not helping them. It's not a fruitful process if the self is not present.
Ego will be there between manager and protector.
It's not so much ego, frankly, and which is why I find IFS a very beautiful system to work with, that both of them genuinely have an agenda of safety. In fact, all parts regardless, have an agenda of protecting the self. That's their ultimate thing in life. So it's not about ego in the sense of what we usually speak about, me versus you. It's about saying, I will do anything to save self. And that anything could sometimes, of course, be very irrational and dysfunctional, but that's the agenda. So it's not ego in the sense of wanting to survive.
In fact, that is the bond between everybody.
Yes.
Safety.
Yeah. It's just that sometimes it's not expressed, and therefore the parts themselves feel that they are in conflict with each other. So I might hate that part of me that refuses to wake up and exercise in the morning, right? But somewhere that part has some safety agenda. I've just not spoken to it, right? So that's one commonality between all paths. All of them are trying to safeguard the self, because ultimately paths are born with the purpose of protecting self and in a way perpetuating existence. That's the whole reason for paths.
Because everywhere there is a payoff.
Payoff, yeah. And if you look at the reason, it's the same reason outside in our world, right? Why do we create systems? We create institutions and families and buildings so that there is perpetuity of existence, right? So I might create an organization so that my name lives forever. So that whole creation of system happens only in that whole quest for existence. And that's the same thing inward also. The paths get created because existence needs to be perpetuated. So there is a common agenda, and the nice part about this process is it hits on that common agenda and says, okay, now talk. And sometimes I would definitely urge you, try this dialogue for yourself, even if you aren't particularly conscious of an exile. Just try it with some managers and firefighters and see how it works, because the conversations are really enriching in terms of how we make decisions internally. And sometimes it's just sheer fascinating process. So that's one simple exercise that you can very safely try for yourself. The only thing, as I said, make sure self is present, and there is a very vocal commitment from the self to the whatever paths that emerge, that I'm here to listen and to understand, and there will be no judgment against any of these paths. In the process, there might be invitations going out to paths saying, okay, are you willing to shift decisions? Are you willing to shift behavior? That invitation might go out, the path might refuse, and that's okay as well, because end of the day, the paths are contained in the family, so there is no possibility of ousting that path. It's there. So it's important to vocalize that commitment from the self to say that I'm here and I'm here to listen. The ultimate agenda with all IFS process is integration. So, and the nice thing with all these paths is the moment the path thinks, okay, the self is safe, my agenda is fulfilled, the path integrates seamlessly. Then you don't have to make an effort to say, come in and integrate. They're very happy to merge themselves. That there's no fight for identity to say I have to survive on my own. So that, because that's not there, the integration is a very seamless part of the process here. So I find it a very beautiful way for, therapy and
specific in the book or something where the guideline is given, like what you said, I can understand, because I did not exactly in a structured way for my problem 2-3 times long back, but then you get, unless that self, if you if it is not in a governing position, then you will not know when you will shift to that
shift to the other.
You think you are the self.
Yeah.
That's what happened. 2-3 times.
So it might help if you can have somebody with you in the room.
So is there any guidelines, structured way?
Not really, because it depends on how that conversation emerges.
This is definitely very useful. But if it is not done in a structured way, then ultimately there will be so many voices.
And if you're not very conscious, you might slip into something and think it is the self. It's not actually the self.
I think some meetings should be every 15 days or a month between the family members and the
Oh, that's a lovely thing to do. Certainly. Inner conflicts get resolved really easily if you're actually doing like an internal family dinner once a week or something. It really helps.
Ultimately, we may give as a image, but ultimately those are inner voices.
There's one part speaking at any time. No? But to answer your question, there's no one particular script as such that you can run through, because dialogues emerge very spontaneously, so it's very different for different people. But yeah, it helps if you can have somebody in the room who's just constantly questioning the self. So questioning in the sense redirecting the conversation back to the self, so that that sanctity of the self is maintained in the process. So even if you have one person who understands the concept and is just there in the room, you're carrying on your dialogue. It's not that the person's carrying on the dialogue. It's just that the moment some part takes over, hijacks the process, if somebody can gently redirect and say, self, what do you have to say? That shifts the energy instantly. So if you're conscious of it, you can do it yourself also. But yeah, you need to be very conscious of the process. But yeah, don't do it for something that's a very traumatic exile. Then it's better if somebody is there with you.
That is why I wanted to, is there any structured way?
You can't, no, because it's very intuitive.
You go into the meditation, first position yourself as a self or something, then invite those, this thing, go into the details of the problem, what you want to solve or something, and then ask opinion of each
part
on that.
Yeah.
Then the voices emerge. But then how to keep control of as a self? I mean, okay, because there will be a sort of a, what you call in Maramari or something.
No, it does happen. So one thing, if I'm using this process by myself, one thing that I usually do is I make sure that the seat of the self is very prominent and visible. And the others are different spaces. Not necessarily, I prefer a circle. The self is there, it's just that the seat is more prominent than the others. So either it's a brighter chair, or the self is a chair and the others are standing spaces. So that there is that visual anchor to say, okay, if I'm getting carried away, come back here. And the moment you physically shift your space, you will realize that the energy shifts and you come back into whichever space you wanted to come back.
I did in that way only, shifting to the third position. That in NLP or something, one exercise.
The spatial anchor,
So, if you have opinion, others' opinion, then go to third
position
as an observer.
Yeah.
And see in that way.
Yes.
I mean, then some insight comes, but sometimes that confusion starts.
So long as you're very aware of the process, it's okay to have that fight also. But yeah, keep track of where you need to be. And end of the day, after that fight, always come back into the self and say, okay, so good that both of you spoke it out, because I appreciate that you had the energy to speak it out because you care so much about the issue. And that there is gratitude for that process. And then start mediating as self to say, okay, now what do you want to do about this?
What next?
So what next in terms of, are you going to initiate a behavioral change? Are you going to do something differently? Are you going to stop doing something? Any of these things could come up as requests. And as I said, that they're just requests, right? So the other part has a right to deny and say not now. And that's okay. So it might say not now, maybe when I'm ready. And you respect that decision and say, all right. So, and if necessary, you can probe a little bit to say, are you not feeling safe enough to say now? So what can I do to make you feel safer? And then it might have a request of you, and then that dialogue continues.
Playing courtroom also. Playing courtroom.
In a way, but not courtroom. I wouldn't use that term because there's no accusation or judgment here. Because as I said, the common ground is that ultimately everyone's protecting the self. Right? So that safety of, all paths always have good intentions, and that's the premise here. So therefore it's not accusations, it is a lot of requests, it's a lot of understanding, yes.
Because previously I did not in this type, but if I am angry, then I used to ask, okay, anger is there, but then what is the fear in that? I mean, why I am getting angry? What is my fear? Then that
Yes.
emerges.
So the angry person is usually a firefighter, right? Who's trying to protect you from something in the environment,
Because
either
I'm
self or
fearing
something in the
losing
environment.
my image
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
So that is the real cause is fear.
Yes.
So that part of me is sensing something. I may lose my face.
Yes.
I may lose something. So other part. So better be aggressive.
Yeah.
But real reason is fear.
Yeah. So then you can step back and say, okay, thank you, angry man, because I appreciate the fact that you're trying to protect me. Now let's deal with that part of me which holds the fear, right? And that let that part emerge. That's also
So
a
what I can do
protectorism.
about that?
Yeah, and then talk about, okay, so you're fearful. Let's talk more. What are you fearful about? And then have that dialogue. So, and then there could be a three-way conference that happens in the process. But the premise with paths work is all paths are good. They always have good intentions. So no need to banish or judge any part in that sense.
Giving fair chance that way because judges who maintain order.
No, so here the self in that sense is a judge in the sense that the self has clarity about existence. The fact that I exist, I'm here now, and I have a purpose for which I'm living. May not be consciously aware of it all the time, but there is a purpose, and let's deal with the space in that context. Okay, so that's the protector for today. Selfleadership.org is Richard Schwartz's website. Yeah, that's pretty much a central resource when it comes to IFS.
Book written by him?
Schwartz, yeah.
What is the name?
Sorry?
Richard
Schwartz.
S-H?
SCHWARTZ.
Okay.
I think the book is called Internal Family Systems only. Actually, there are several resources even on the website that you can read. Yes, WARTS. TZ. Yeah. Very interesting perspective. There are a lot of videos and books also on the website. Selfleadership.org. Yeah. So that's that for today. Next time we'll deal with the exiles and then we'll move further into the series. Thank you.